Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today for the ISO 14001-2015 and its impact on R2 companies webinar. So today we're going to talk about it's kind of the overview of what the ISO 14001 changes are all about and what potential impact they can have on R2 companies and what you'll need to do basically to transition or upgrade your system to meet the new ISO 14001 requirements. So my name is Scott Jones. I'm the EHS Program Manager here at Perry Johnson Registrars. I'm also a lead auditor for ISO 14001 and R2, OSAS 18001, and several other standards. So hopefully I can bring some of the auditing techniques as well as, as a company, what auditors will be looking for when they come to your site for this transition. And then if you have any questions from the certification side or anything like that, feel free to contact me as well for that. I'll leave a few minutes at the end, probably like 10, 15 minutes for questions and answers. So if you have questions, feel free to type them in the question box, and I'll answer those at the end of the webinar. If you have more specific questions or you want to talk in more detail, feel free to give me a call or send me an email. Here's the main phone number and email. I'll have my personal email at the end of this presentation. So we'll talk a little bit about PGR, what we're all about if you're unfamiliar with us, some of the benefits and drivers to get certified to not only 14001 but R2 as well. And then we'll talk about where we are with the transition process for 14001 and then what other standards are looking to get revised in the near future that could have an impact on R2 companies. Then we'll talk about the key changes that have come out of the 14001-2015 standard, and we'll follow it up with the certification requirements for either those who are not certified yet or looking to get certified, or for those companies who are currently certified and will need to transition to the 14001-2015. So again, if you have questions, please feel free to type them into the question box. I'll answer all the questions at the end of the presentation. All right, so for those of you who are not familiar with PGR, we are one of the leading R2 registrars in the world. We have offices throughout the world to help best suit your needs as far as auditing companies, especially with the growth in Asia and Latin America. We have a number of auditors in those locations who can audit to R2 and 14001 and 18001. So we can audit to a number of different standards. We're accredited by ANAB and UCAS for a variety of different standards. Here's a list of some of them. Obviously, you have 14001 and R2. So these are just some of the services that we can offer as well. And we also have an R2 2013 online training as well as a RIOS online training, which you can find those at our website if you're looking for some additional training. All right, so 14001 benefits for getting certified. Obviously, for those companies who are trying to achieve 14001 who are already 14001 certified, the whole purpose of being 14001 and having an environmental management system in place is, one, to help you identify what your environmental aspects are. What are your environmental impacts or potential impacts that you have? And then how are you going to reduce those or eliminate those impacts? That's the whole purpose of the standard, is to reduce your environmental footprint and reduce the potential for environmental pollution. So with the 14001-2015 version, there's a much larger emphasis on external communication and making sure that companies understand the impact that they can have on neighbors or neighboring facilities, neighboring towns and cities, whether it's air pollution or noise pollution or whatever it may be, understanding what those potential impacts are so you can help reduce that throughout your local area. Supplier environmental performance, companies who are supplying you with goods or services, making sure that they're aware of your environmental policy, making sure that they're helping you improve your environmental performance by what they do. And then providing a competitive advantage. Obviously, if you're 14001 certified and you're going up against somebody else for a bid, the fact that you have 14001, which is an international standard, tells everybody that you're doing things the right way. You're trying to better the environment and better your company as a whole. So kind of gives you that a little bit of an edge. So here are actually some of the R2 benefits. So we have, obviously with R2, the main focus is not only protecting workers on site and also the environment at your facility, but also downstream. So making sure that you're using companies who are going to be processing your material further, who have health and safety standards in place, who are putting programs and controls in place to protect their employees as well as the environment. So this really shows the community and shows your clients that you're making sure that not only what you do on site, but what's being done downstream has a positive effect on the employees, the communities, and the environment. All right. So for those of you who weren't really familiar with the changes in 14,001 when it was coming out, really what it's all about. Every few years, usually every 3 to 4 years, a new version of the standard comes out. Obviously, the last version for ISO 14001 was 2004. So 11 years is a long time to go without a change. So with that, there still isn't a whole lot of drastic changes that have occurred in this revision. The formatting, if you look at the standard, is completely different. It'll follow the same formatting as ISO 9001 and the same formatting that all future ISO standards will have. And we'll get into what that looks like here in a minute. But when you go through the standard, like I said, it looks completely different, but as you get into it, you'll notice that the requirements really haven't changed that much. Like I mentioned earlier, the focus really has shifted from an internal view to not only internal but external as well, making sure that you've identified those aspects and impacts that your facility can have on the neighboring communities, on your downstream vendors, or on suppliers, or basically anybody who is involved with your organization. So ISO 14001 2015 was published on September 15th of this year. So the transition process for those companies who are certified is 3 years, which means companies will have until September 14th of 2018 to complete that transition process. So what that means is for companies who are still looking to get certified, you have 18 months from that date to get certified to the old version, to the 2004 version. After that 18 months is up, every company will have to get certified to the 2015 version. So for companies who are currently certified to the 2004 version, you're going to want to transition during your recertification audit. That's usually when it's most effective and cost effective to transition. If you transition at a surveillance audit, depending on the size of your facility, there may be some additional costs because we need to make sure that you meet all the new requirements to 14,001 2015. But if you're transitioning during a recertification audit, which is a full system audit, we're going to have to go through everything anyway, so there won't be any additional time required. So again, the client can transition at any point during that 3-year process. The only real restriction, I believe it's May, I think it's coming up, but I believe it's May 1st of 2018. All organizations have to transition, have their transition audit by that date, and that's a PGR requirement. Because it takes time, if there are any nonconformance or any issues identified, to close those out, get your audit package reviewed and approved by our executive committee, and then issue your certificate. So we want to make sure there's no lapse in certificates, no one loses a certificate because of this transition. So we want to make sure that everybody has their audit in enough time to have it approved and done by that September 14th, 2018 date. So during this 3-year process, a 2004 certificate is equivalent to the 2015 version of the certificate. So until you transition, or if you get certified now and then to the old version, then you transition later, it doesn't matter. It's equivalent. You're still ISO 14001 certified. So yeah, it is May 1st, 2018 is basically the deadline for you to have your transition audit. So if you have any questions on when you should transition, what's the best time frame for you to transition, if you're going to have a recertification audit coming up in the next 6 months, but you're not going to be ready by then, contact us. We'll figure out and work with you to determine what the best date is and what the best time frame is for you to transition. All right. So that's a little bit of the transition process. Obviously, it's an overview. A lot of this is a higher level overview of the changes of how it affects R2. If you have specific questions, you don't understand what some of the requirements mean, and contact me. We can go through those in more detail. So this is the new structure for ISO 14001, 2015, as well as all future ISO standards. So the ISO 9001 2015 version, which just came out on the same date, September 15th of 2015, follows the same structure. So for those of you who are 14001, 18001, and R2 certified, 18001 will be changing to ISO 45001. That's anticipated to be released towards the end of next year, 2016. And that's going to follow the same structure. So for those companies who are 14, 18, and R2, it may make sense for you to wait for the 18 to come out so you can transition all three at this, or all two, 14 and 18 at the same time. So the structure follows these 10 chapters. You have your scope, normative references, terms and definitions, which really haven't changed. Those three have always been there. And then you get into context of the organization. Now this is really where the core requirements of the standards start. You have context of the organization, leadership, planning, support, operation, performance evaluation, and then improvement. And we'll get into kind of what each of those chapters mean and how they can impact your R2. So within the Annex SL, which is the structure of the new standards, they have common terms and definitions. A lot of these are similar to what they were before. They haven't changed. But there are a few new and unique environmental terms that are in the new 14001 standard, which we'll discuss. So here we have the PDCA model. The old version had the PDCA model as well. So the difference, if you're familiar with kind of what that image looked like in the old standard, similar to what it is here, but there's slight differences. As you notice, in the center of this is leadership. All the ISO standards now focus on leadership. It's not just we're going to have one management representative. They're going to be responsible for ensuring that all requirements of our management system is met. It's now, okay, here's top management. Top management needs to be responsible for their areas and their departments. So they need to be aware of how their activities and their operations impact the management system. So if there's legal requirements, environmental aspects, and impacts involved in their department or their area, which almost every department area has them, they need to understand how those can impact the management system and the organization operations. You'll also notice on the left-hand side you have internal, external issues going into this, and then the needs and expectations of interested parties. So there's a much larger emphasis on the external communication in those interested parties and how they can impact the organization and how the organization can impact those companies. But otherwise, you'll notice it really hasn't changed much. You still have your plan, do, check, act model. So for those of you who are not familiar with this, you start out with the planning process. You develop your manuals, your procedures, your documentation. Once you have all that established, you implement that. You train everybody. You make sure that the procedures and the controls that you planned are implemented. Once you've let everything kind of run for a while, you've had a chance to see how everything's operating, then you can evaluate it. Your internal audits, compliance evaluations, reviewing of your objectives and targets. So you're going to review that. Any issues that you've identified will go into that improvement process. So whether it's a preventive action or continual improvement, which we'll get into, there's no true preventive action anymore, but the whole standard is basically one big preventive action. But that'll go into that improvement process, which is reviewed generally during your management reviews. And then action items or outputs will go back into that planning process. So it's a continual cycle for continual improvement. So the key changes in the new 14001 standard Like I said, there's a greater emphasis on leadership, the focus on risk management, especially for new processes or equipment, emphasis on objectives, measurement and change, communication and awareness, and then fewer prescriptive requirements. So the standard was really developed to ensure that any company in any industry of any size can get certified. So they don't want a number of prescriptive requirements that companies have to follow. They want companies to be able to set up their own management system to meet the standard. They don't want basically the standard to determine how an organization operates. So there's very few prescriptive requirements. Everything's very general and gives organizations greater opportunity to make a management system fit their organization. Because often as auditors we see a lot of systems in place that are very similar across the board. Companies have to have an internal audit procedure. They have to do it this way, and they have to have compliance evaluation, and they have to do it this way. And it's not really the case. It's up to you to determine how you're going to document that procedure or that process. How are you going to, what is that going to look like? Is it going to be, because it says compliance evaluation, not compliance audit. So how are you going to evaluate your compliance? It doesn't have to be an annual audit like an internal audit. You can determine how that's done to best meet your organization's needs. You may have a lot of that already in place where you're monitoring and measuring it and evaluating that compliance on a regular basis. So don't necessarily change what you're doing to ensure that you meet the standard requirements. You're probably already doing a lot of that. So regarding terms related to support and operation, risk is the effect of uncertainty. And then you get into risks and opportunities. This is one of the core definitions that's been added to the 14001 standard that really drives the new version. So risks and opportunities are potential adverse effects or threats and potential beneficial effects or opportunities. So as you're going through the needs of interested parties, as you're going through your aspects and impacts and your compliance obligations, you need to identify some of those threats. What are the potential negative impacts that they can have on your operation or on the community or interested parties? How can you reduce or eliminate those? Then you get into the potential beneficial effects. So are there ways that you can kind of launch off of something that you've identified for an opportunity for improvement that can have a beneficial effect on your organization? Then we get into terms related to support and operations. So the concept of life cycle kind of drives that risk assessment. So the life cycle, they want, depending on what you're doing, if you're obviously a recycler, you're getting used products, so you don't really have a lot of input on new material, on material or components that are going into that product. So they don't. That's why it's not necessarily a requirement for all organizations to do the life cycle analysis, but they want you to at least evaluate what potential impact it could have from beginning to end. So if you have zero effect or impact on what happens to that product before you get it, then you're basically looking at it from that point downstream. So what are you doing to process that material? How are you processing it? What chemicals are you using? What mechanical processes are you using? Is there any way to reduce those risks? Where are you sending it downstream? Who's your downstream vendors? How are they processing it? What type of processing are they using? Can you use a different downstream vendor that has a less hazardous process? Or as far as transportation, there's a lot of pollution that goes along with the transportation. Are you shipping it overseas? Are you shipping it to a nearby a facility? All that needs to be looked at with that life cycle. And then lastly, how is it being disposed of? What's the end of life for that product? So for recyclers, you don't have as much of an impact on kind of what happens with that, since you're not necessarily in the design phase of it. But for those that potentially are, or a portion of your processes are, that's definitely something to look into. And then lastly, environmental performance. this is one of the key drivers for the standard. So you go from doing your risk assessments, which is driven by the life cycle thinking, and then finally your environmental performance. How are you ensuring that you are improving your environmental performance? Now it's not just how am I going to continually improve my management system, it's how am I going to continually improve my environmental performance. Because the main purpose of the 14001 is to improve the environment, reduce the potential for pollution. So you need to have measurables in place, and you need to be monitoring and measuring those measurables to determine how much of an impact you've had on improving that environmental performance. So here's a little bit more in-depth breakdown of some of the key changes. You have strategic environmental management. So there's increased prominence of environmental management within the organization's strategic planning process. The upfront of the planning process, there's a lot more work now. You need to make sure that you're doing full risk assessments on everything internal and external. So before in the standard, a lot of it was, am I going to, as far as external goes, am I going to communicate externally regarding my significant aspects or other issues, and you could kind of choose whether or not to do that. Now it's not an option. Now you have to communicate that. You have to make sure that everybody's aware of how your operations can impact them. Leadership, like I said, there's no specific requirement for you to have a management representative anymore. You do need to make sure that all management, though, is aware of their requirements and how they can affect the management system. Typically, you're still going to see a management representative. It's still difficult to, have multiple people keep track of the management system. They can keep track of components, but it's still probably a good idea to have one person who kind of pulls it all together. But there is no specific requirement, so it's really up to the organization how they want to address that. Protecting the environment. So the expectation on organizations has been expanded to commit to proactive initiatives to protect the environment. So like I said, there's no clause that says you have to come up with preventive actions. It's kind of thought of as the whole standard is one big preventive action. So you need to be proactive with your operational controls, with your controls that you put in place for your legal requirements and the aspects and impacts that you're going to reduce the potential environmental impact. So again, we talked about environmental performance and life cycle thinking, so I'm not going to go too in-depth on this, but if you want to go back through and read these in more depth, the presentation will be available after the webinar. You can email me for copy, or the live version is being recorded and will be posted on our website within a few days. All right, then we have communication. As I've stated before, there's been a change in kind of the emphasis from internal communication to external communication, and then documentation. Documentation really is changed to documented information. Now, it doesn't say you have to have this procedure, this environmental manual in place. It says you need to have documented information. What that looks like really is up to you. Most companies, I envision them still having their procedures, their manual, but due to kind of the shift from hard copies to electronic, they've just opened it up to saying documented information. So you have some more flexibility in how you want to approach that and achieve those documentation requirements. Okay, so now we're going to get into the actual breakdown of the standard and what are some of the impacts on R2 companies. So with R2, like I said, there's really limited big changes in the standard. It's really a broader way of thinking. All the requirements for the most part are still there. They haven't changed. So your procedures shouldn't change drastically, and what you're doing shouldn't change drastically. It's just a little broader way of thinking to look externally now. So Chapter 4 through Chapter 10 is really where the core requirements are. So Chapter 4 the objectives of companies giving more consideration to external issues and impacts in their environmental management system. And then you have the needs and expectations of interested parties are to be better understood and evaluated as to whether they give rise to specific requirements. So as far as R2 goes, when you look at provision 1, this really requires R2 companies to look beyond their own operation to those companies who could be impacted by their operations or whose operations could impact the R2 company. So really what this would look like is potentially a change in your scope. Instead of looking only internally, you're going to look externally. You may have a change in your policy. You may add some of those requirements for external environmental protection and making sure that you're looking out for whether it's transportation or potential noise pollution for the neighboring communities or air pollution. There's a variety of things that you could look at, but looking at updating your policy, updating that scope, those are kind of some of the key changes. And then objectives and targets, you're going to be the objective and targets aren't going to solely focus on what you're doing on site anymore. They're going to have to be expanded to how are you reducing potential pollution downstream. So you want to look at that as well. So those really are where the changes will come in. They're not drastic. They shouldn't be that exhaustive, but just some minor modifications to your management system. Chapter 5 gets into the leadership. So top management should take on more responsibility, like I've stated. You can update the policy to make sure that a commitment to protect the environment beyond the corporate boundaries is included. Again, a management representative is no longer needed. So really there's not a lot of change. It's just making sure that top management across the board and across the company is aware of all the requirements. And for the most part, a lot of companies have already doing this, but it's just trying to take the responsibility off of one person and distributing that. A lot of times if the management system or an audit doesn't go well, the management representative is the one who gets blamed because they're the one who's supposed to be managing it. They're the one who's responsible. We're trying to get away from that and basically make sure that everybody within the company is responsible for their areas. Because if you have, let's say, an objective and target in place for the recycling portion of your operation, that operations managers should be aware of what those, or that department managers should be made aware of what that objective is, how do the activities of their employees affect that objective, or if it's a legal requirement, affect that legal requirement. A lot of times, as an auditor, we'll go on site, and a company will have objectives and targets in place, and only the president or the management representative and a select few others will be aware of what those objectives are. They're not communicated throughout the organization, especially to that department who can directly impact that objective and target. So if they're not aware of how their responsibilities and their activities can impact the objective and target, you're going to have a much more difficult time of achieving that objective and target. So that's kind of why there's more emphasis on making sure that top management is aware. So when we come on site and we're auditing, we're going to be interviewing the top management for those areas, making sure they understand the legal requirements, making sure they understand those objectives and targets and those aspects and impacts in their areas. So there may need to be more training that's conducted to make sure everybody's aware of their responsibilities. Obviously, that's up to each organization how they and where they're at with that and how they plan to achieve that. Chapter 6 gets into the planning. So chapters 4 and 5 really just kind of set the foundation, the groundwork for your management system and determining what direction you want to go, what it's going to look like, identifying those boundaries and the scope and all that, coming up with that policy of kind of what direction your organization is trying to go as far as environmental protection, environmental management. So once you've determined that, you can get into that planning process. Again, that's your identifying those aspects and impacts, evaluating those to put controls in place to reduce them, identifying those legal requirements so you can make sure that you're in compliance to those legal requirements, and in areas where you can, improve and go above and beyond the legal requirements to reduce potential environmental pollution. So the impact that it has, especially on R2 companies, is you need to consider the type of processing that you're conducting on site. So if you're doing, CRT dismantling, or you're doing shredding activities, what controls do you have around those activities? How can you improve that? Are there other processes that you can put in place of what you're currently doing to reduce the potential environmental pollution? There's a lot of new technology that's coming out, and a lot of this technology can even be more cost effective than what you're doing now. So you definitely want to keep an eye on these constant changes with technology and different processes. And also the type of downstream processing that's being conducted. Make sure that when you're selecting downstream vendors to further process material, that you're choosing companies who are using less hazardous processes or less hazardous materials within those processes. If they're trying to use more environmentally friendly chemicals versus more hazardous ones. So looking at all that when you're selecting downstream vendors. So your typical downstream vendor survey and questionnaire that you probably use may need to be beefed up a little bit to include some of these more environmental questions. And then also, as far as reuse goes, what type of criteria are you establishing for your reuse? Do you have certain cutoffs? Maybe trying to increase those margins so you can have more material going for reuse. Identifying additional markets where material that you were recycling can now go for reuse. Obviously, a lot of this is the business decision, and some of it will be more costly than others, but the idea is to at least look into it to try to identify opportunities to improve your environmental performance. So in 6.1, we talk about actions to address risks and opportunities. As we talked about in the terms and definitions for risks and opportunities, this is where it's kind of like with RIOS. If you're familiar with RIOS, it addresses your your footprint. Risks and opportunities is really that. You're going to evaluate your entire system, not just aspects, not just legal requirements. Those definitely will be included, but they're not the only things. If you have customer requirements or downstream vendor requirements, supplier issues, all those need to go into this risks and opportunities now. So again, it's not that the requirements have drastically changed, it's that it's a broader scope now. You need to look beyond your facility and look at how suppliers can affect what you're doing. If you're outsourcing anything, how do they affect your environmental management system? So as part of this, you need to ensure or do your best to ensure that you're preventing and reducing any undesired effects, including the potential for external environmental conditions to affect the organization. So when you look down for that impact on R2, you have risk, reduce identified environmental concerns, and opportunities, areas for improvement, which we talked about. So really, a lot of this seems repetitive because for the most part, it is. There's a lot of overlap throughout the standard that basically says the same thing, but it says it for different stages in your management system and for the development of your management system. So at the end, we can basically break the changes down into 2 or 3 core things that flow through your entire management system that need to be looked at, and we'll get to those. Again, you have your environmental objectives that need to take into account the downstream now. So there's not really any new additional requirements, but you just still need to make sure that any objectives that you have in place are really meeting the intent of the environmental management system to improve your environmental performance. So that's the main driver now. When auditors come on site, they're going to want to make sure that your objectives and targets, at least a portion of them, are really driving that continual improvement of your environmental performance. Support, Chapter 7 really hasn't changed. So you still need to make sure that you have adequate resources in place, that you have proper training being conducted, you have the appropriate documented information, you have proper communication in place. So Chapter 7 is really just a rewording. you'll notice that in Chapter 7 when they talk about awareness, it could be awareness training, especially for new hires or ongoing training. They pulled that out into its own subclause. It was always there. So there's some things that look different, but they're really not. They may have been just pulled out and expanded upon, but really the core requirements are still the same. Chapter 8 for operations. Obviously, this is one of the smallest sections, but really has the largest impact on your organization. Because when it comes to operation, it basically says you need to put controls in place to maintain your environmental management system. So but that includes controls around your aspects and impacts, your legal requirements, your objectives and targets, and your everyday operation. So however you are going to operate for recycling or for reuse, making sure that those procedures and those controls have an environmental kind of mindset to them to help improve that environmental performance. So here, this affects provisions 3, 4, 5, 6, and 8. So you have your 3 is legal requirements, 4 is basically your EHS, your environmental health and safety requirements, 5 you have the recycling and downstream, 6 is your reuse, and 8 is data destruction. So the controls that you put in place in the work instructions or standard operating procedures or whatever you have in place for these to meet the requirements for these provisions need to have that environmental mindset. So when you're dealing with transportation, what type of transportation are you using? Where is it being transported to? Is there a way to reduce the environmental impact from transportation? Are you sending full loads versus or partial loads versus full loads? What can you look at to help improve your environmental management? So again, this goes not only at your facility or not only from your facility to your tier 1, but to the end of life. So again, it needs to be consistent with that life cycle perspective. So from the time that you receive that material to how it's disposed of. You may not, you may use a tier 1 that determines their downstream vendors, but you are the one who chose that tier 1. So in essence, you're still responsible, and you still have some requirement or impact on the end of life of that product. So you could choose to use somebody else, or you could require that tier 1 sends it for further processing to a different company or handles it in a certain way. I mean, a lot of it obviously is a business decision. There's different costs involved. So it's not saying that you have to do things certain ways. Obviously, you have to look at the costs and benefits and determine what's best for your organization. But the idea is to have that environmental mindset. So Chapter 9, for performance evaluation, it really places more emphasis on your monitoring and measuring. What are you doing to show that you are continually improving your environmental performance? So what sort of inspections are you doing? What sort of environmental monitoring are you doing? Or when it comes to health and safety, which will be coming up, what sort of health and safety monitoring are you doing? For your objectives and targets, are they truly measurable? Can you truly show environmental performance with those objectives that you have in place? You have internal audits, compliance evaluations. How effective are they at improving your environmental performance? So these are all things that you need to look at. So for recyclers, a lot of times it's one big thing is how much material or product goes for recycling versus reuse. A lot of companies may try to send more material or more products for reuse versus recycling. That's a measurable thing that you can show that you're improving your environmental performance, because the more that goes for reuse, the less pollution that's going downstream. And then lastly, we have improvement. So it's the correction of nonconformities as well as the continual improvement process. This is your corrective action process, identifying and addressing your nonconformances or noncompliances, or just overall areas or opportunities for improvement that can help improve your environmental system. So Chapter 10 is kind of an all-encompassing, you need to improve your system. Before, a lot of environmental management systems were, they had objectives and targets in place, but it was more so we're going to put objectives and targets in place because we have to. It may not really show continual improvement, or may not show improvement of an environmental management system or environmental performance, but we're going to put it in place because we need something. So that whole concept has really changed. Now they want you to show improvement of your environmental performance. So, like I said, there's a few key overall overarching drivers to the new standard. The one is your risk assessments. So your risk assessments are going to include not only what's happening on site, but it's going to include everything that your organization has a potential to impact, whether it's on site, downstream vendors, suppliers, outsourcing, whatever it may be. So that risk assessment needs to be done for all of that as part of that life cycle thinking. So from that, you need to identify ways that you continually improve your environmental performance. So those are kind of the two things. Not that those are new, but they're just broader. It's a broader way of looking at them. So that's really the core changes in the standard. I don't think they're that drastic. If you go through the standard, it can look pretty daunting at first, but once you get into it, I don't think it's that bad. So take a look at the standard, take a look at your management system and what you're doing. If you have questions, you're concerned about certain gaps that you may have. Obviously, I can't consult, but I can help clear up some of the requirements in the standard. So feel free to contact me, and I'll help you the best I can. So within the ISO 14001 standard, there's Annex A, Annex B, and then you have the bibliography. So Annex A is a guidance on the use of the international standard. It's a very helpful tool to use as you're going through and trying to develop and implement the new requirements. So as one of the questions we always get, it's a guidance document. Can we get audited to the guidance document? No. As auditors, we're not allowed to audit to Annex A. We can only audit to the actual standard. The guidance is just there to give you some best management practices, some ideas on how to implement the management system. Annex B is basically just a matrix that shows the differences from the 2004 version to the 2015 version. It shows where the clauses match up as far as say, legal requirements in the 2004 version versus the clause number for legal requirements in the 2015 version. So it kind of helps you understand where the changes are, what's similar, and where the old requirements are in the new standard. And obviously the bibliography was a number of documents that are out there that went into developing the standard. So some of those are helpful to look at in understanding some of the requirements of the standard. If you're interested in looking at that, those are there. So that's really the breakdown, kind of a high-level breakdown of the changes to the ISO 14001 standard. There's not a whole lot of impact on R2 companies, as you can see it. But I really wanted to put this together because I know I've had a lot of R2 companies contact me and are a little nervous about the changes and how it's going to impact them. So I just wanted to kind of go over and show you that it's really not that bad. So certification steps. So this goes for 14,001, 9,001, 18,001, R2. So it's the same certification process for any of these standards. So the first thing you're going to do is establish your documentation, or that documented information. Once you have that documentation established, you have those controls established, and then you can train everybody to those, implement them. Once they're implemented for a while, again, you conduct your internal audits, your compliance evaluations, you do your management review. After all that, you're ready to go. You're ready for that certification audit. You're ready for us to come in and audit you to R2 or 14,001 or whatever standard it may be. So assuming all goes well, you may have a couple issues that are identified. Once those issues are closed out, we can then issue your certificate, and you're officially 14,001 or R2 certified. That certificate's good for 3 years. However, you're going to have audits in between. So you'll have surveillance audits every year. If we identify a number of issues through those surveillance audits, we may end up putting you on what we call semi-annual cycle, or you could also choose to be put on a semi-annual cycle. We have a number of companies who do choose the semi-annual just because a year is a long time to go, and a lot of people like to be kept honest and make sure that they are maintaining that system. So your surveillance audits are partial system audits. They're not full system audits. We're going in there and auditing areas of previous nonconformances and areas of concern and identifying, auditing some of those core concepts that we audit every audit. So a semi-annual is generally half the time. So you might have some additional costs, but between semi-annual and annual, the costs really aren't that drastic. It just means you have 2 audits instead of 1. And then if you choose the annual, you'll have 2 annual surveillance audits, and you'll have a follow-up with a recertification audit on that 3rd year. So after that recertification audit, you'll be issued a new certificate for an additional 3 years, and that certification cycle just continues. So again, the transition process for 14001, you have 3 years to transition. You can get certified to the 2004 version for 18 months following the release date of 14001, which was September 15th of this year. And then after that 18 months, again, everybody has to be certified or get certified to the 2015 version. So here's a little bit more in-depth breakdown of that certification process. Your stage 1, which the certification audit is broken down into 2 stages. Your stage 1, which is really just a documentation review, will be on site. We'll review the documentation, make sure what you're doing on site matches up with your documentation. Once you're determined ready to proceed to stage 2, the stage 2 will occur. This is really an audit on the implementation of your management system. Generally occurs 30 to 45 days out. We'll make sure that your system's been implemented properly. If there's any non-conformances that are identified, you'll have to address those. Once those are approved, then we're good to go, and we can issue that certificate. And then, like I said, you'll have surveillance audits, either 6 months or 12 months, followed up by a recertification audit every 3 years. All right, well, that's all I have, so I'll open it up to any questions that you may have. So again, in the panel on the right, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in there. I'll give you a few minutes to type any in if you have any. Again, the presentation will be available at the after the webinar. If you want a PDF copy of the slide, you can email me. My information is right here. So shoot me an email. I'll send you the presentation. If you want the recorded version, it'll be up on our website within a few days. I don't see any questions. I'll wait one more minute to see if we have any, but hopefully this was helpful in setting your mind at ease that the changes really aren't that bad. They're not that drastic, and it really shouldn't be that difficult to transition to the new version of the standard. So, but again, if you have questions as you're going through the kind of the planning process of establishing some of those new procedures and requirements, and you're not really sure what that requirement means, you can definitely contact me. Or again, if you want to talk about when would be the best time to transition, you can talk to me. All right. Well, other than that, that's all I have. So I appreciate everybody's time, and I appreciate everybody participating in the webinar today. We'll have some more coming up on more in-depth changes to the 14001 standard. We'll go through the different portions of chapters 4 through 10 and kind of break down, in a more detailed level the requirements and the changes from the old version to the new version. So I appreciate everybody taking the time today. Hope everyone has a great day, and hopefully we'll see you on some future webinars in the near future. Thanks, everyone.